This is Logan Thomas, tight end for the Washington Commanders, and you're listening to the Best Bell Fantasy Podcast.
Howdy, everyone. It's Bradley Stalder, and this is episode 30 of the Best Bell Fantasy Football Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, Jody Smith, senior analyst and editor of Fulltime Fantasy, joins me to discuss wide receiver rankings and tiers. In particular, we're going to be looking on Underdog Fantasy, using that ADP as the guide for our thoughts in tonight's discussion. Jody finished 13th in FantasyPros wide receiver accuracy rankings, 17th overall last season. He's consistently one of the best rankers in the FantasyPros accuracy contest, both week to week and season long. You can follow him on Twitter at Jody Smith NFL. Jody, how you doing tonight?
Doing okay, man. It's good to catch up with you again. I think you and I got together late last season, right when you were in the midst of your little hot streak there, ranking players yourself, and we were able to go over some things. And we talk all the time on Twitter, so it's nice to be able to reunite and get excited about this upcoming season, because we're definitely getting close.
Absolutely. At the end of last season, for those tuning in, I finished 3 of the last 4 weeks were top 10 accuracy on FantasyPros weeks. Jody and I go back and forth, and I'm glad to contribute. I think I contributed 1 article so far for Full-Time Fantasy, so we'll see.
Yeah, we did that. I got to edit that, and you made it pretty easy on me. But hopefully everyone understands like how difficult it is to consistently be able to be that good at ranking FantasyPros. For you to, I know you were number 116 in week 16, which
17. Week 17.
Week 17, when those weeks just become crazier and more difficult to rank. So in my opinion, it becomes harder to succeed. But for you to have multiple top finishes towards the end of the year, that's when the playoffs, that's when they matter the most. And if you're doing the most accurate rankings at that time of the season, that's commendable. That's the kind of thing that can really take up traction. And like I said, I don't think people understand how difficult that system is, how it rewards people that were thinking outside the box, and how it punishes people that miss and try to manipulate the system. But kudos to you, because like I said, the reason I'm here today is because of the success I had a decade ago at FantasyPros, and you're up and coming. For you to be able to do that, I hope people appreciate just how difficult a feat that was, because I don't know that I had more than 1 or 2 top 5, top 10 finishes overall last year. And I finished 17th overall. Actually, I finished 17th consecutive years. But to find multiple weeks to do that, pretty awesome.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Jody, you're consistently near the top anyways. And so I'm a big believer that iron sharpens iron. That's why we bring you on the podcast and bring a lot of other experts in the field. So I'm really privileged to have you on as a guest tonight. Let's jump into it. I've identified 10 tiers. So the top 10 rounds or so in Underdog through 120 players. And I had to go in and manually select some wide receivers per tier, and I'm actually going to add to the stream. I did a little PowerPoint presentation for us here, Jody. You'll notice a theme throughout all of the presentations where there will be wide receivers dancing. The wide receiver highlighted here for me is Justin Jefferson. I have him right now, and I haven't finished my projections yet, so this is just a feeling in the dark ranking. Justin Jefferson's my wide receiver 1 right now over Cooper Kupp. I do think regression is coming for Kupp, and the reports out of Minnesota are that they're going to be pass heavier, which is going to be in favor of Justin Jefferson. He was a wide receiver 2 or higher 40% of the time for you last year. I think wheels up for Justin Jefferson in a pass-heavy offense. What are your thoughts about this first tier, Cooper Kupp, Jefferson, and Jamar Chase?
It's a clear tier. Any way you look at it, there's a clear top 3 when it comes to wide receivers. In my opinion, if you're doing redraft, these are the only 3 wideouts that you can possibly consider taking in round 1. I also, after Billy and I got together here at Full-Time Fantasy, we got together for our little rating summit where he weighed in his way of looking at things from a high stakes lens versus what I do, which is more dynasty and redraft. We also came up with Jefferson being our top number 1 wide receiver, but it's not a huge gap. And like at this point, if you want to go for the TD upside of Jamar Chase, it's hard to argue that. If you want to go with the PPR, what Cooper Kupp did last year, clearly regression is going to be in order, but 80% of Cooper Kupp is still arguably the wide receiver 1 overall anyway. Like I said, this tier's right on. It's just an issue of how you personally want to order it. And like I said, I don't have a problem with anyone saying, you see this a lot, and because it's really interesting over the last 5-ish years how dynasties become more prevalent. So that actually alters the way everyone, even in a redraft, thinks. Because a lot of people have difficulties disassociating from dynasty to redraft. So it becomes interesting to see how that, and also it's made things, Bradley, you've probably noticed this, it's made things more difficult to do trades because people now, I've noticed, have gotten more difficult over the years because people are approaching things from an asset viewpoint through a dynasty. It's just really interesting to me how the market has changed over the years in sports betting. That's the next big thing, and we'll see how that. It sounds silly, but if someone wins a huge bet, maybe targeting a team or a particular player, and they keep winning money on them, that could cause that person to over-evaluate their players from a redraft standpoint.
Yeah, no, I feel that in a lot of the dynasty leagues, attaining young assets has become even more difficult. And I think that at the start of your dynasty leagues is when you're getting the most traction and most movement. But I'm in some dynasty leagues that have been around for a few years, and they become a little more stale. Whereas at the beginning of getting these fresh wide receivers or fresh running backs, like there's a lot more movement because your perception is the right now. And then now that we've fast forward a couple of years, the perspective of the players is now changed because you've seen a couple championships already in that league, and that player's values become more stagnant and more stabilized. So I get that. And then the redraft, like a lot of my league mates aren't trading with me in the 3-for-1s anymore.
Maybe they got burned one too many times, buddy.
Fair enough. One other player. So if I were to move anyone out of this tier, I think it is Ja'Marr Chase, though. He's competing significantly with T. Higgins. He's going to be limited to about a weekly cap of 25-26% target share. I think seasonally he's going to be more at about 22-23%. Same thing with T. Higgins. And you mentioned the touchdown upside and the efficiency upside. He smashed that his rookie year, but I wonder if the hype is too much for the bust games that we saw last year as well. Like Kupp and Jefferson had almost no bust games. Again,
we're on agreement here. My personal point differential between Cooper Kupp and Justin Jefferson is fewer than 2 points, which is basically insignificant on the grand scheme of things. But it's a 40-point drop off in my projections personally between Kupp and Chase. So I'm in agreement. I don't want to drop personally. I don't know. You're at the bottom end of round one, and Ja'Marr Chase is sitting there versus, I don't know, Leonard Fournette, Derrick Henry, depends on your format or whatever. I can see why someone would be interested in going with Chase. Like I said, it's just a personal thing. I can understand why someone would want to take him number one overall, but like I said, you and I are on the same page with it. It's pretty comfortable with him as third in that top tier. But like I said, this tier, and it's pretty much everywhere.
Yeah,
it's three guys, and there's a significant drop off. You shouldn't be taking, in my personal opinion, you shouldn't be taking any other wide receiver in round one of any sort of redraft, with the exception of those three. And maybe you could argue just two of them.
I think that's fair. We'll move on to the next tier. Stephon Diggs, Devonte Adams, CD Lamb. Now, Diggs is getting drafted in the first round. Devonte Adams near the end of the first round. If there's anyone, if Ja'Marr Chase falls to a tier, it's obviously going to be this tier. And I wonder if there's like Diggs and Chase are closer than what people are giving credit for, given the connection that Diggs has with Josh Allen. And like from taking a team perspective, like taking a step back and looking at their teams, would you rather stack Joe Burrow and Ja'Marr Chase or Josh Allen and Stephon Diggs? I think that's a tough question.
It's pretty tough. I think personally, I'd rather go with the upside because, again, we just talked about how we both agree that Chase is ahead of Diggs. And I also have Diggs here as right there. He's only a few points behind, but I still would prefer the upside of Chase versus the difference between Allen and Joe Burrow. But that's pretty close because, yeah, that's actually a really good question. And I think in debating that, I think it would be fair to ask what other assets you're getting. Okay, by dropping down a little bit on this tier, what did I gain out of it? Am I moving up a few spots, or am I a little bit better at running back?
Yeah, that is a tough question from not just like a team to team construction, but also you mentioned your roster construction as well, because Josh Allen is going significantly ahead of Joe Burrow. But to be fair, I'm also a lot lower than consensus on Joe Burrow going into this season.
I'm just curious, where do you have Burrow?
I have Burrow at quarterback 10 right now.
10, okay. Yeah, I think he's around 8 for us. And
consensus is 7 right now. And I didn't want him out of that spot, but I felt like I know we're taking like a detour, but Russell Wilson I'd rather have over Joe Burrow. Tom Brady I'd rather have over Joe Burrow. And then you can give me credit for this, Jody, or you can blame me, one of the two. But before I posted my Joe Burrow versus Jalen Hurts video, it was Joe Burrow going ahead of Jalen Hurts, and now it's the other way around. So, Jody, you can call me an ADP mover, but
the trendsetter, huh? You know what? All early in this offseason, I just told people I didn't necessarily believe in Jalen Hurts, and I thought I don't know. There's no reason to think that he's going to get hurt, but I just had this impression. I don't know, man. He's struggling as a passer. But the more you look at things, and then after they made the trade for AJ Brown, starting to warm up to Hurts a little bit. So yeah, he's comfortably ahead of Burrow now, just not everywhere. But a good point that Billy said is that it feels like Joe Burrow probably peaked last year. Everything went right. It's hard to really see him getting significantly better than 4,600 passing yards and 34 touchdowns, 2 more on the ground. It was a great season. Even with all that, though, he was still, QB7, QB8.
Doesn't run, but he was coming off a massive ACL, right, MCL, meniscus injury.
Unless you see rather significant improvement on his part, which made it feels like maybe he's hit the max. I don't know. Well, I guess we'll see when he's fully healthy. If that actually adds things to it, then we can all be wrong. But it feels like that's a good point, that he's about wide receiver quarterback 7, 8. Feels like he's already peaked, and that's about it's real top heavy right now at quarterback. So it feels like that's about right for him. So I think the ADP for Burrows, it's pretty good.
I feel like constructing a roster, the best wide receiver of this tier is CeeDee Lamb. Just with how late Dak Prescott is going. Dak I have ahead of Burrow as well. And we know Lamb's going to get a massive target share. The number 2 receiving option is probably going to be Dalton Schultz. And getting CeeDee Lamb in the second round and stacking with Dak, who's going 9th, 10th round in Underdog, I think that's a good spot.
My biggest concern, like right now, for the second tier wide receivers is actually Devonte Adams. And I don't think people are taking into account the difference between Aaron Rodgers and Derek Carr was fine from a fantasy perspective. So he's got one season under his belt with 30 touchdowns. He might even have 0, but I think it's 1. But I know that him and Devontae teamed up for Fresno State. We've all heard that fact. It's just
the
like
shower narrative, right, Jody?
Yeah, we've all heard the whole converted basketball player playing tight end. These are things that once those narratives take up traction, people go with it. But Devontae Adams, such a huge red zone threat. Last year, Aaron Rodgers was 5th, 427 red zone passing yards, and he was 3rd with 30 touchdowns. And same time, Derek Carr was 15th. He only had 17 red zone passing touchdowns. It's a little bit unknown to me with the Raiders. Like, what are they going to do offensively? You're breaking in a new offensive coordinator in Mick Lombardi. He's a little bit of an unknown. He was the wide receiver coach in New England, and it's not like the Patriots are well known for developing a bunch of wide receivers and all that. So that's another factor that could work positively, could work negatively. But so Adams has double-digit touchdowns in 5 out of his last 6 seasons. He's 120 plus targets in 4 straights. I don't know that kind of volume is going to persist in the new locale. And one thing I looked at with the Raiders, looking at the Fulltime Fantasy Strength of Schedule tool, overall, when you incorporate everything, and our little tool has everything, including kick returners, defensive line, linebacker, and all that, the Raiders have probably the hardest schedule in our Strength of Schedule tool of the whole league. But they're 28th versus the past this season. And going down the stretch, making the playoffs, that's awesome. But so Devonta Adams and the receivers for the Raiders have a pretty tough playoff schedule. Starting in week 13, they play the Chargers, the Rams, the Patriots, the Steelers, and then they end it in week 17 with 49ers. Those are all potential top 10 secondaries this season. Personally, Devonte Adams, I'm fine with him staying in tier 2, but I would definitely take Diggs and Lamb comfortably ahead of him. And a guy that we're about to talk about here in tier 3, Mike Evans. The more I've looked at things, I've actually bumped Mike Evans up to my wide receiver 4 overall ahead of Diggs, but we'll let you hit on that first if you want to talk about him. Or if you want to start on tier 3?
Yeah, we can start on tier 3. And Mike Evans, man, here's a stat about Mike Evans. They're of the top 24 wide receivers last season in fantasy points per game. Every single wide receiver had at least a 20% target share, except Mike Evans. He had a 17% target share. And he still was a top 12 wide receiver. He's looked for in the end zone. He's affectionately known as a goal line wide receiver, big bodied. And we know that it's important for the Bucs and for him and for his legacy and all of that he gets his 1,000 yards every year. Death, taxes, and Mike Evans gets 1,000 yards.
8 straight.
8 straight. And he's going for 9. And look, who else is going to catch passes aside from Russell Gage, who I love? I've been in on Russell Gage for the last 2 years. So you're talking, as Billy can attest to, Billy is my witness. I have the Russell Gage truther in all things fantasy, both dynasty and right now. But if it's Mike Evans, Russell Gage, there's no Tyler Johnson. There's no Jalen Darden. Rob Gronkowski's retired. It's not Cam Brate. It's not going to be Cade or whoever is going to be playing tight end. Leonard Fournette's going to get his. Keyshawn Vaughn's probably going to get sprinkled in. Rashad White's going to get sprinkled in. Yep. But it's going to be Mike Evans who reclaims his 25+% target share as long as Chris Godwin is out. And I was talking last night, if you haven't checked out episode 29 of the Best Bell Fantasy Football Podcast, check it out. I talked with Dr. Edwin Porras of Fantasy Points, and he talked about how Chris Godwin's probably not going to be back until mid-October, or earliest is October 3rd. Probably November. It's not looking good for Chris Godwin to be back for the most of the first half of the season. So in especially season-long best ball leagues, or in like drafters, or if you're trying to get that million in the Underdog Best Ball Mania 3 for regular season most points, Mike Evans is probably going to need to be on your team, and he should be considered in the second round here ahead of Devonta Adams. I agree. And I think he's definitely a tier 2 wide receiver.
Yep. Like I said, I've got him at wide receiver 4, 27 touchdowns over the last 2 years. And he's in a really good spot to potentially lead all wideouts and touchdowns yet again this season. But the big key for him is going to be that unfortunate Chris Godwin injury, because I love Chris Godwin, and I started off getting so many, just drafting him so much early on, but it's starting to look bad. I'm really concerned that, if I'm not mistaken, the Bucs have a week 10 bye. You're talking about a team that should coast to the playoffs. They're in a division that's in turmoil. I really see them keeping him out, even if he's ahead of recovery time. I really see it as legitimate that he could sit out until their bye. So you're talking about not having him for potentially until week 11, which that's rough. It'd be nice to get him down the playoff stretch, but his ADP still, we'll talk about him, I think, in a little bit here. It's still a little too high for what he's at. But this is one thing I will say. I looked at how Mike Evans did last year in the 4 games to round out the season after Chris Godwin got hurt. And this includes a couple playoff games, but he averaged 10 targets, 93 yards. He had 5 total touchdowns. He scored in each of the 4 games and averaged 23.5 PPR points in those 4 games. And from a fantasy points per game perspective, that would have ranked number 2 overall among all wide receivers.
That's the same exact number that I was going to bring up if you weren't going to bring it up there, Jody. So great minds think alike. In just the regular season games, he was averaging 21 fantasy points over the last 2 seasons with Tom Brady and Chris Godwin not in the lineup. We're both seeing the same stats, seeing Mike Evans the same way. I agree. He should definitely be in that tier 2 and back end of the first round consideration at the start of the second round at that turn. Okay. Any others you want to hit on tier 3?
No, like I said, I would just swap Mike Evans up to the top of this tier, and I'd move Devonte Adams either to the bottom of it or to the top of tier number 3. But other than that, it looks good.
Okay. Let's move on to tier number 4. And we see 2 Chargers and 1 Michael Pittman. Pittman is going some places as the wide receiver 12. I've seen him go off the board there. But back-to-back Chargers, Keenan Allen, Mike Williams. Is this the Cooper Kupp, Robert Woods scenario that we ran into last year where we weren't sure which Los Angeles wide receiver it's going to be, and it was flip a coin because we don't know? I think I do know, and I want your take before I give you mine.
Okay. This is one of the disagreements that Billy and I had on our projections for full-time fantasy, because when I first punched in numbers, I want to say Mike Williams came in at around wide receiver 28 for me, significantly lower than he's going now. It's Billy who feels the opposite. Billy, and I love Billy. I think he's brilliant. I love the way he looks at things from high stakes. So after talking me off of that, I had to really evaluate some things. But I still feel like in this tier, wide receiver 13, I'm not interested in Williams. You can argue him up, for me personally, up to about wide receiver 20, which isn't even in this tier. That's just my personal perspective. But it feels like to me, when I look at Mike Williams, it felt like he really balled out last year in a contract year. He got what he was after, and that's always a minor concern. You can look at it either way. Some people argue that, it's proven that players play out. And there's others that are going to say, nah, there's really nothing to it. It's just people are just looking at it because it's fresh in their head. But I'm looking at Mike Williams overall. So if I'm having to spend here a third or early fourth round fantasy pick on him, even last year when he was great, he had 7 games with single-digit PPR points. He had nine games with fewer than 65 receiving yards. And as good as he is in contested catch situations, as much as I love Justin Herbert and I love this offense, this is a playoff team easily and all that, Williams should score more, in my opinion, than he does. He was tied for 8th with 23 red zone targets last year, but he had the 4th worst red zone touchdown catch rate of any wide receiver. He's down to 180 something. It's like really low. I'm looking at numbers from our good friends at Fantasy Data. Again, I don't feel like targeting Mike Williams this high is necessarily egregious. It's just not something I'm not going to have him rostered very much, because I have to disagree with Billy, and I respect Billy. And if you're going to go the other way here, maybe you can help talk me out of it a little bit. But I just feel like we're all paying for 2021 Mike Williams. We're not necessarily taking his full resume. And like I said, the little inconsistencies last year, I don't know. I just feel like he's being overdrafted.
So my response is it depends on the format. And given that this is my focus here is in best ball, I think it's Mike Williams over Keenan Allen. But if you are redraft full PPR, there's no way that you can take Mike Williams that high. If you are setting a lineup, because that's my perspective on for redraft. If you're setting a lineup, it's really difficult to put Mike Williams in as anything better than a flex play. But if you are setting a lineup, Keenan Allen, 40% of the time, 40% of the time, going to give you a high-end wide receiver 2 outing. That's what's going to happen. And that's what I looked at. I looked at their bell curves over the last couple of years, and Keenan Allen's just consistently a high-end wide receiver 2. In fact, he had 0 wide receiver 1 weeks last year, and there were 43 other wide receivers who had a wide receiver 1 rate higher than Keenan Allen last season. But Mike Williams had 17% of his weeks as a wide receiver 1, 16% as a wide receiver 2. So he offers more upside, but as you mentioned, when the lows are low for Mike Williams, it's devastating. So in a best ball format, I think Mike Williams, he is a very interesting wide receiver 2, and especially given the lack of upside that other wide receivers are showing you that are going in this tier or the next tier below or the next 2 tiers below. I think Mike Williams deserves to be in this conversation as someone who can give you elite weeks, even if they're inconsistent.
I love how we started off at the top of the show. I mentioned how I'm generally looking at things from a dynasty and redraft standpoint. You're absolutely right. I agree with your best ball perspective there. That's not something that is what I factored in the way I was necessarily evaluating this. So it's a fair argument can be made. And yeah, that's why it's important to.
Depends on the format is my takeaway. Yeah. Like I would agree he should
Big
be
time.
Closer to that wide receiver 20 or so if you're drafting casually on ESPN or Yahoo or wherever your home league is. Okay, let's keep going. Tier 5. This is where it starts to get a little bit more nuanced, I think. We started with some nuance with Mike Williams and Keenan Allen, but I think it's clearly in the best ball streets, those players, well, and Michael Pittman does offer like, he had like almost no wide receiver 1 week, right, but had wide receiver 2 weeks. And I think that the volume that Matt Ryan's going to get him is going to keep him in that spot. But this tier 5, I think, separates itself because there's uncertainty surrounding a lot of these players. Marquise Brown is on a new team. Jalen Waddle, there's Tyreek Hill. Cortland Sutton has a new quarterback, but is also competing in targets with Jerry Judy and Tim Patrick and Albert Akuagbunam. There we go. Javonte. And if you haven't checked out my TikTok, Jody, today I put a little TikTok together about how it's difficult pronouncing his name. But Javonte Williams as well. So that offense, we don't know what it's going to look like, if it's going to be Sutton or Judy. DJ Moore has the quarterback questions perpetually, and Deontay Johnson has the quarterback change, and they brought in Pickens. So there are more questions in this tier, I think, than all the other tiers we've had so far.
Yeah, here the real thing with this tier, there's a ton of talent, but it just depends on your perspective. So if we're hitting on best ball, I believe Hollywood Brown probably deserves to be at the top of this particular tier because of the upside. You've got excellent quarterback in Kyler Murray, and you're going to have DeAndre Hopkins missing for the first six weeks of the year. So you want to take that kind of speed that Brown can deliver. And I don't know that with the way Hopkins his career's developed, I don't know that he's that deep threat necessarily anymore. He may be used more in the middle and intermediate and shallow area of the field now and on drags to clear out space for Brown to go deep. So it remains to be seen. I think he fairly, from a best ball perspective, is ranked here and as the top of this tier. And just conversely, if you're a redraft person, DJ Moore and Deontay Johnson's consistent PPR roles are, what I would push towards the top of this particular tier, just because they're safer. At this point, if you're looking, especially if you're fortunate enough, and these are your wide receiver 3s, you've already started off running back, and these are somehow the draft falls just right, that would be ideal from that perspective. The only guy I feel doesn't deserve in this tier is Jalen Waddle. Mm-hmm. It's simply because I don't feel like it's humanly possible for Waddle to repeat last year's numbers. I had some numbers written down about the pacing of Miami and all that. I don't know what happened to him, but just briefly. So by signing Tyreek Hill and Cedric Wilson, those two guys alone commanded 221 targets last year for their respective teams. They're going to get plenty of looks, in particular Hill, who dedicated a first-round pick plus. For Hill, you're re-signing to money. He's clearly going to be a huge factor in the offense. And we know that Tua has a pretty nice, solid arm. He can get the ball downfield. It remains to be seen with Tyreek Hill. If you look at him, his yards per catch has actually declined, I think, 3 or 4 straight years. So it'd be interesting if that's more of a physical thing because he's missed time. Hill's missed at least one game in 3 out of 5 seasons, something like that. And then also Chase Edmonds, a pretty good pass catching back. He's going to command plenty of looks. Even Raheem Mostert, he can do a little bit of as a pass catcher too. So I just don't see Jalen Waddle coming anywhere near the 100 and I want to say off the top of my head 142 targets, whatever he had last year. So, and with his lower touchdown numbers, he's a guy that I would probably drop out of this tier entirely.
Let me see here. So the one player you didn't mention at all in this tier is my favorite player in this tier, and that's Cortland Sutton from a best ball perspective. But I'll take a step back. Cortland Sutton, I was smashing him in round 5, smashing. And as you see at ADP, now he's the back end of the 3rd round. I can't do it anymore. I love Cortland Sutton. His best ball upside is massive compared to Jerry Judy. Like, he's a downfield threat, big body wide receiver, touchdown maker. We've seen spike weeks from him despite the existence of Drew Locke and Terry Bridgewater and all those other quarterback fill-ins, even Joe Flacco, right? The elite one himself.
I've got Sutton top 20 overall in my projections, but the biggest thing is, how are they going to be used? Is he DK Metcalf and Judy's and Lockett? That's the most logical sense if you're looking at things from a comparison to playing with Russell Wilson type perspective. That's the way I think most of us are looking at things. But you know what? It could be the reverse. Maybe Jerry Judy's the guy who leads the club in targets. So it's that tiny bit of uncertainty and a little bit of unknown, which is why I didn't necessarily hit on him. But for argument's sake, like I said, looking at full-time fantasies projections heading into the season, he's right there at wide receiver 19.
So one of the things that is not mentioned too often about the Miami Dolphins, you faded Jalen Waddle, and that makes sense. In the big board drafts I was doing at the end of February, I was drafting Jalen Waddle at the back end of the second round, start of the third round, and this was pre-Tyreek Hill trade. But my thought was Devontae Parker's probably not going to be on this team. Devontae Parker had a 22% target share last year. He did miss some games, but this is a player who was a big-bodied wide receiver, and now you insert Tyreek Hill, who's going to command a little bit more than that, but not a ton. And so my thought is, yes, Jalen Waddle's going to take a little bit of a hit. Maybe it's Mike Gesicki takes a little bit of a hit, but there were the likes of Mac Hollins were being thrown to in Miami for a time. So I think that Jalen Waddle, he probably does deserve to be dropped down out of this tier, but let's not go crazy. Jalen Waddle had one of the best rookie seasons we've seen, and if it wasn't for Jamar Chase, we'd be talking about Jalen Waddle as the wide receiver one probably in this class.
That's fair. I still have him as he's wide receiver 26 for us. So he's not. It's like I said, it's not like I'm saying he's garbage or anything. Like that. I just don't feel like he's been a little bit overdrafted right now, and I don't see he had 4 touchdowns. So there's I'm still going to have concerns about Tua, and I think everyone else that's kind of looked at things should too. It's hard to see that offense necessarily maintaining 2 top 20 fantasy wide receivers.
And one last note before we move on to tier 6. If you want to draft Keenan Allen, why not just wait around and take Deontay Johnson? They're essentially the same. They'll give you the same wide receiver 2 output is my thought. And on a new offense, Mitchell Trubisky's or Kenny Pickett are probably going to be an improvement over an aged low A dot.
Yes, about to say, a lot of people are going to say, we don't know who's going to be quarterback, but really, Big Ben was toast. When you look at 2020, he started fading pretty bad then, and he pretty much had nothing left last year. The only thing you can say positive about Roethlisberger last year is that he excelled at getting rid of the ball, but that was the product of
bad offensive line.
He never had time. So
let's move on to tier 6. And this tier 6 is very large because there's a lot of different players that I have very strong opinions on who should and should not be in this tier. I'm going to throw a couple your way and we'll volley back and forth. Jerry Judy, I don't think should be in this tier. I think Terry McLaurin should, or even the one above it. Same thing with DK Metcalf, should be above it. Allen Robinson should be in that tier, but as you put in the show notes, his value is gone. He was getting drafted a lot later, in round 5, round 6.
Yeah, the glory days of March and April and early May when Allen Robinson was still like wide receiver 40. Just the auto. He's in the queue.
Smash.
Every time. Yep, but now people wised up to that. Do you recall someone jumping up so many spots when injuries and all this weren't a factor? He's really gone up like half of what his ADP was for a while there in the early part of the season.
Absolutely. Gabriel Davis, I don't think deserves to be there. He's the wide receiver 24. And in a lot of drafts, Jody, I hope you're sitting down. He's getting drafted ahead of DK Metcalf in a lot of drafts. I've seen it plenty of places. I can't make it make sense to myself. Like, how is the wide receiver 1 who's coming off a 27% target share, who's shown upside with backup quarterbacks in Seattle, going behind Gabriel Davis?
That's Well, two reasons. Number one is you just hit on it. Backup quarterbacks in Seattle. Like right now, do we know who's going to be quarterback for Seattle? Drew Locke and Geno Smith. 5.5 wins is their over under. That doesn't sound great. But
so they're going to have to be throwing a lot.
And the other key point, yes, actually, we're going to hit on that in a little while. The other key point, recency bias. What's the last time we all saw Gabriel Davis on the field? What did he do?
Crushed.
In front of everyone, 4 touchdowns and all that. I don't know where to come out on Gabriel Davis because a lot of smart people in this industry that I trust and I'm friends with, Brad, you could say the same thing, love him. And then there's a little bit of us. There's a lot of us who are a little more like, well, you know,
the us
down here. Let's I'm not saying he's not going to be a good wide receiver. I'm just a little concerned, like I said, if that recency bias. I can't get Gabriel Davis because I'm never willing to move him inside like my top 28, top 32. And again, just looking at this tier, here he is up here at 23, 24 in that area. And the guy listed on the tier that I'm looking at, DK Metcalf right ahead of him, I'm going to take my chances because I know what DK Metcalf is. And I'm probably going to take 10 out of 10 times. I'm probably going to take Metcalf over Davis, which explains why, like I said, I don't have him rostered anywhere.
Give me Rashad Bateman. Give me Brandon Cooks. Give me Juju. Give me Darnell Moody. Like all of those other players have shown for a long time, or at least over the course of a full season, Gabriel Davis couldn't even beat out a 35-year-old Emmanuel Sanders for targets. Like that's the hard thing about Gabriel Davis is for him to hit. If the argument, it's best ball, he can give you a couple spike weeks, I get it. But why couldn't you just draft Rashad Bateman or Brandon Cooks when you could get maybe not similar upside because they're worse offenses, I think, but the more consistent week-to-week production, they're going to be making your best ball lineups. Gabriel Davis is within the range of outcomes that he doesn't make your best ball lineup pretty consistently.
Well, Another thing I consider, with Buffalo is that there's a better supporting cast that could potentially take targets from that wide receiver 2 spot. You have James Cook, very good college pass catching back, and apparently by investing a second-round pick in him, that's what they plan on using him for. And me personally, I feel like Jamison Crowder is a pretty big boost ahead of what Cole Beasley could do for that team last year coming out of the slot. Again, and then you brought in O.J. Howard. So that's a third guy that could potentially be on the field taking targets away from that wide receiver 2 spot.
Yeah, I think it's clearly in this, like who should not be in this tier? Jerry Judy, Gabriel Davis, and Chris Godwin. And we've hit on Godwin already. But yeah, the Judy one I want to hit on, then we'll move on to tier 7. I sent out a tweet a couple weeks ago, and it was, if we see the jump of Jerry Judy from where he was at any time over the past 2 years to where he's being drafted right now, it would be a similar jump from what we saw in 2020 to 2021 Cordero Patterson. That's the type of jump that we're projecting for Jerry Judy. And if we're drafting him in the top 4 rounds, like his ADP is 43.9, he's getting drafted in the top 4 rounds. I know he's connected to Russell Wilson, but the upside hasn't been there even with Cortland Sutton out. And I am concerned about Jerry Judy actually catching passes. He struggled with the drops. He struggled actually catching passes that were good too. And maybe an improvement is there, but yeah, I am concerned about Jerry Judy in the top 4 rounds.
The only other guy on this tier that I would probably consider. Are you still hearing me?
Yeah, I hear you.
Oh, it feels like you went mute all of a sudden there. Darnell Moody, this is a guy that I think Billy and I were both on the same page with. At one point, I had him as my wide receiver 14. I've calmed down a little bit on there, but he's into the lower 20s for me right now. But he was 11th in the league last year at 140 targets. He had 5+ receptions in 7 of the final 8 games. And this is when Justin Fields finally started hitting his stride. He had double-digit PPR outputs in 8 of the final 10. And there's an unproven supporting cast around Mooney, which makes me think that he's just going to continue to get just funneled and peppered with targets. It's not like the Bears under Matt Eberflus are going to be worse than they were under Matt Nagy.
Can't get much worse.
It can only get better as far as I love. So I feel like Mooney's a guy that people are asleep on a little bit. And I'm one of the higher people. Like I said, I was just in the Fantasy Index magazine, which is coming out next week's, folks. So if you're still old school like me and like to actually look at things, make sure you pick it up. But I'm the only person that I believe rated Darnell Moody as a top 20 guy. And he was at that point when it was pretty early that we turn it into. He was like wide receiver 14. I've got my reputation on the line with him this year, but I'm happy to scoop him up every time out of this tier, and he keeps falling. I'm pretty happy with it.
He's one of the probably easiest players to stack because the Justin Fields stock has dropped significantly. Cole Kmet is super cheap. Darnell Mooney is there. And then you've got combining the target shares of Cole Kmet and Darnell Mooney, you probably have 50% of the targets. Yeah. To be honest, with Jimmy Graham gone, it's going to be Cole Kmet season and Darnell Mooney season because I don't think Velus Jones, the draft capital, is going to get him some targets, but I'm not convinced that he's very good. His player profiler comp is Van Jefferson. So he's a team's wide receiver 3. And he's an older prospect. I was discouraged by by the Chicago Bears not surrounding Justin Fields with more weapons in the offseason. Now, maybe they do. Maybe they sign a free agent or something. But right now, I agree with you. Darnell Mooney he's definitely at least near the top of this tier. Okay, let's move on to tier 7. This is where there are some big shifts or bigger questions. Amari Cooper, obviously a lot of hinges on the Deshaun Watson situation. You're nodding your head. We both know that this is going into day 3 of deliberations of how long Deshaun Watson is going to get suspended because the NFL, it seems like they're pushing for an indefinite, but it's more of a placeholder indefinite than an actual, like, we want him suspended. I have a feeling that it's more of a save face situation than we want to punish him because he did something that was wrong. And I think Amari Cooper's fantasy value is most tied to Deshaun Watson. If there is a wide receiver in almost any of these tiers whose value can fluctuate the most, I think it's Amari Cooper based on this decision.
Yeah, if you knew Watson was not going to be suspended, you probably move Cooper up 10 spots to the wide receiver 20 range just based on his consistent PPR performance. But if you knew that what it's looking like right now, which is more likely, is that Watson's not going to play and that they're going to be going to war with Jacoby Brissett, then it's hard to even – I wouldn't call Cooper at 30 with Jacoby Brissett egregious, but at that point, it's not someone that I would target very often. I guess you could argue he could move down 10 spots more out of this tier completely. This tier, like you said just a second ago, it's really interesting because this is the area where if you're attacking running back early, which I'm generally doing, these are the kind of guys that I'm happy are available in this middle part of the draft. I feel like there's a pretty good upside with all the 4 on the bottom part of this tier: Elijah Moore, Devontae Smith, Adam Thielen. I feel like it is a really nice bargain with his consistent ability to get into the end zone because there's some reasons that he's getting a little older and all this, but I'm interested in how Minnesota's offense is going to evolve. And if that chemistry with Kirk Cousins remains, I don't see any reason why Thielen doesn't again contend for 9 to 11 touchdowns. And if that's the rate, then he's at least 10 spots lower than he probably should be. And then Drake London, we all loved him coming out of college, and for him to be the number 1 receiver in this draft. And this is a really solid first round draft for wide receivers. For him to be the undisputed top dog there, I'm pretty interested. All these guys to me offer plenty of upside. If anything, the one in this whole tier I'd be least interested in is Amon-Ra St. Brown. And that's not for any other reason than all the weapons that Detroit added to their offense. It's going to potentially take targets away from St. Brown. And it's hard for me to envision him maintaining that kind of volume that made him such a stud down the stretch last year.
That's, I think, built into the ADP at this point. He's going around 6, and TJ Hawkinson didn't play a lot. DeAndre Swift didn't play a lot while he was going off. But I think one thing that was, like, I've changed my opinion on Amon-Ra St. Brown. If you read one of my articles that I wrote for Fantasy Data back in January or February, I said Amon-Ra St. Brown is a sell. the Lions are going to bring in a big-time alpha wide receiver, and that's going to be who Jared Goff is going to be throwing to in 2022, plus all the Swift and the Hawkinson, blah, blah, blah. And it may not be the only wide receiver that they add. But based on who the personnel that the Lions brought in this year, the DJ Chark role is what Josh Reynolds and Khalif Raymond and other peripheral roster wide receivers, those are the routes DJ Chark is going to run this coming year. Amon-Ra St. Brown, I think, is going to be a closer line of scrimmage, like a TJ Hawkinson. I think that'll be impacted a little bit, but like they drafted Jameson Williams, and talking with, once again, Dr. Edwin Porras yesterday, he doesn't expect Jameson Williams to get back until mid to the end of November at the earliest.
That's first.
And so like the earliest that Jameson Williams probably comes back, so Edwin said, I don't want to misquote him, the absolute earliest he could get back into game action is the beginning of October. But based on that's extremely aggressive. So we're looking at more middle of November, more reasonably and realistically. Also thinking about what the Lions are playing for. They're not going to rush him out. There's no incentive to rush Jameson Williams out. And secondly is, I lost my thought there. I was on a roll and then I lost it there, Jody. But
yeah, you had it.
Let's see. Jameson Williams, he was out. And then he also mentioned there's a difference between getting back to game action and being at peak performance, where we saw Jameson Williams was absolutely at peak performance at his time at Alabama when he was crushing. If it wasn't for the ACL injury, there was consideration that he would be the 101 in this wide receiver class based on what he was doing at Alabama. So there's no incentive for him to get rushed out there. And looking at what the Lions have done from a managerial perspective, you have to trust Brad Holmes. And this is coming from the Packers truther. Like, look behind me. I've got my Tunyon jersey. I've got my Green Bay Packers signed mini helmets. I've got my cheese head even on the background. This is from the Packers homer who's saying the Detroit Lions are going about it the right way. And there's no way that Brad Holmes is going to put any jeopardy into his prized first-round pick wide receiver that they traded up to get. They're going to treat him like gold. So I don't expect Jameson Williams to play very much this season. Yeah. That's why I'm a little more bullish on Amon-Ra St. Brown. I think this is a fair ADP right now for him. But, okay, we'll keep going. For the sake of
it. Look at where he is in my numbers. Wide receiver 39. So, yeah, it's in the same ballpark, same tier.
Okay, let's keep going. We'll try to keep it under an hour or so. DeAndre Hopkins leads tier 8, but he's obviously suspended for 6 games due to performance-enhancing drugs. Michael Thomas is in this spot. Russell Gage, Renfro, Burks, and Ayuk. Is there a player that you aren't drafting from this tier, and is there a player that you're targeting in this tier?
As much as I think Michael Thomas at wide receiver 37 has the potential to be a value, he's not someone I'm targeting right now because he hasn't even started taking the field or doing anything that I'm aware of. And I have no interest in Jameis Winston this year. I've hit on that multiple times that people are overrating him. I don't even want him as a QB2. I don't think he plays every game for the Saints. So it's a little bit of uncertainty with Michael Thomas there. And again, Drew Brees is back under, and if he's actually on a field for OTAs and Drew Brees is there, you move him up 15 spots at least. But Treylon Burks is a guy I have a lot of interest in. I think he's got a ton of upside. He was comped all offseason to A.J. Brown, and that's exactly what spot he's going to walk into. But my guy in this tier, and we talked about him earlier, Brad, I know you're a big fan of him, is Russell Gage. 100 targets over the last 2 seasons. You're talking about a more abundant Atlanta team that had very little supporting cast. Listen, the Bucs are paying him $30 million. They did that for a reason. He's not coming in to just play a secondary role. He was top 12 in wide receiver route win rate last year, which is pretty impressive. He's walking in to that Antonio Brown role for a fully healthy Tampa offense. And that's only going to get better because we all just agree that Godwin's probably going to miss at least half the year. That means he's actually going to be in an elevated role beyond that of what Antonio Brown was. And listen, if Gage could be wide receiver 37 with Matt Ryan on that team last year, now he's going to an offense with a team that's going to make the playoffs. You got Tom Brady, who had 3 top 12 PPR point per game wide receivers last year. 3. There's a sneaky chance that Gage can actually get up and be a borderline week to week wide receiver 1, but I feel pretty comfortable in offense. Let's say on a rare occasion that I actually took tight end early, so I'm a little bit like a round or so behind. If I feel like I can get Russell Gage as a wide receiver 2, especially a wide receiver 3, I'm all over it.
Oh, you spoke my love language here, Jody. I think I'll have to invite you back on the podcast, just how much love you showed to her.
Hey, this ADP is still pretty nice. I expect it's going to keep shooting up.
Yeah, he's been one of the biggest risers since the Gronk retirement. Speaking to the Russell Gage, he was wide receiver 37 last season, but if you remember, he was not playing a full-time role at the beginning of the season, got hurt the whole bit. Calvin Ridley was there. If you look, he played 14 games last season. He had 5 games where he was a top 15 wide receiver for a weekly basis. In fact, 2 of his last 4 games, he was a top 7, and 3 of his final 6 games, he was a top 8 weekly finisher among all wide receivers.
He was wide receiver 34 in points per game.
Yeah, so this is a player who he's been underrated his entire career. I've been so happy he's on almost every dynasty team that I have. He's only 26 years old, 6th round draft pick out of LSU, Russell Gage. Love to see it. I also agree with a lot of what you said about Michael Thomas. He could be the wide receiver 5 overall, but he could be a complete 0 again this year. And I don't know if that's worth the risk even at wide receiver 37 right now, given that you could get Russell Gage here. All right, let's keep going. Tier 9. All right. There's one player I want to talk about in this tier. Okay, 2 of them. One player in particular I want to talk about in this tier, and that is the featured player in the slide, Tyler Lockett. Now, tell me about Tyler Lockett. Why are people overreacting to the quarterback controversy that is Drew Locke, Geno Smith? And would it matter if Baker Mayfield gets there?
That's just icing on the cake. I'm guessing that's the main reason why everyone is avoiding Tyler Lockett so bad. But for him to be so consistent, was wide receiver 16 last year, and Russell missed, even though Russell Wilson missed 4 games of the season. But for him to be down here, wide receiver 45, man, I'm going to have to jump all over it. I'm going to take my chances. Drew Locke and Geno Smith, I get that they're not the best guys. But if you'll remember, Lockett last year, he came out the gate and had 278 yards and 3 touchdowns in the first 2 games. And then he, even with Russell Wilson, was really struggling. But his best game of the season actually came with one Geno Smith under center in week 8. Lockett snagged 12 of 13 targets for 142 yards. So it's not if Geno Smith happens to be the quarterback that there's just no hope of Lockett being able to do anything. He's had 100 targets in 3 straight years. The Seahawks projected to win 5.5 games. They're going to be playing from behind. Plenty of favorable game scripts for the passing game, regardless of who's under center. I don't know, man. I don't get why everyone is shying away from Lockett. That's the only thing that makes sense to me, is that it's that bad that we're that concerned about Drew Locke and Geno Smith. But if I can get Lockett down this far, down as my wide receiver 4 or 5, or at least someone that if you have expanded flex spots, I'm all over that in PPR scoring personally. Do you differ? Do you agree? Or is this somebody that you wanted to hit on because you want nothing to do with him?
Oh, no. I am all chips in on Tyler Lockett. Let's be clear. There are only 3 wide receivers that have been top 10 in wide receiver 1 rate for half PPR each of the last 2 seasons. Devonte Adams, who's going as the wide receiver 5, new quarterback, new system, new everything. Tyreek Hill, new quarterback, new system, new everything, wide receiver 9. And Tyler Lockett, new quarterback, not a new coach.
Same system.
Wide receiver 45. Make it make sense to me. I love getting Tyler Lockett because his spike weeks win you weeks. And this is the type of player that why you can take more risks in best ball with your wide receivers if you get a volume of wide receivers. These are the league winners. These are the differentiators, the types of players you want to be targeting. I like Kadarius Toney and the upside that he offers. I like Christian Kirk and the floor that he offers. But Tyler Lockett has shown time and again the elite. Like, we're not talking just baseline, Oh, he's barely getting there. Wide receiver 2. No, he's among the most elite wide receivers in the rate at which he gets those elite tier, those top 6 weeks. And that's the type of player that going at this spot, you better be smashing 100 times out of 100 times.
And again, if these two quarterbacks, whoever's playing, are Baker coming in would just be icing on the cake, because you're talking about if Seattle were to trade for Baker, you're going to see Lockett skyrocket up into the top 30s. That's why the value was so strong on him now. But you're looking at, if these quarterbacks are struggling to get the ball to DK Metcalf deep, all it does is just add more underneath funnel targets to Lockett, and they'll take those. Hey, garbage time points, they count just as much in fantasy football. So if the Seahawks are down by 23 points in the fourth quarter and they can't get anything going deep, then you know what? Then Lockett's just going to rack up 4 or 5 catches every drive. And about that.
Let me see. There's one other wide receiver I want to hit on here, and that's Marquez Valdes-Scantling. He's going at wide receiver 47. Obviously, there's a lot of smoke coming out that he's gelling well with Patrick Mahomes, blah, blah, blah. The average best ball points added rank over the last 3 years, Juju Smith-Schuster, wide receiver 65. Marquez Valdes-Scantling, wide receiver 60. When it comes to upside, let me see if I can find the charts that I was trying to find them and I couldn't find them in my Twitter timeline. But if you search FO Staller, you can find the charts that I have. Let me see if there are photos here. Oh, here we go. I'm going to share this on the screen. I haven't even. Okay, give me one moment. I'm going to share the screen because I'm a nerd. And here we go. This is Juju Smith-Schuster. What we're looking at is a points distribution 2019, 2020, and 2021 for Juju. And those vertical lines are their 84th percentile outcome. So obviously in 2020, it was about 21 points. In 2019, it was about 16 points. And in 2021, it was 11 points. He was injured. Fine. But let's look at Marquez Valdes-Scantling. 19, 17, and back in 2019, when he wasn't even playing almost at all, it was like 8 or 9. The upside is really close between Marquez Valdes-Scantling and Juju Smith-Schuster. Sure, and this is where redraft versus best ball, those matter. Marquez Valdes-Scantling is a real avoid in your redrafts. There's no way that you can take confidence in the smoke that's going on preseason and say, yes, Marquez Valdes-Scantling is going to be the wide receiver 1. But what we've seen is Marquez Valdes-Scantling runs the routes that get fantasy points. He's led the league the last 2 years in average depth of target with Aaron Rodgers. And Rodgers, his ball percentage or his deep ball rate was like top 10 or whatever. Mahomes was top 2 or 3.
Yep.
There is a significant tier jump from Aaron Rodgers to Marquez Valdes-Scantling, plus the volume of passing, plus the volume of plays that are run. The Packers were the slowest team in pace of play last season. Enter Marquez Valdes-Scantling, who doesn't need to do as much now because last year, like Devonte Adams was it, and then it's Lazard behind him, blah, blah, blah. Marquez Valdes-Scantling offers so much for your best ball teams. This is a best ball target for me in this round, him and Tyler Lockett. So I don't know if you want to throw in some thoughts on MVS or the entire Kansas City Chiefs team, but
no, I don't know what to think of the Chiefs. No, I think they'll be fine, but you're talking about a complete revamped offense. I'm sure that inevitably Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes will get together and they'll make it work. But there's some upside in some of these guys. And MVS perfectly stated, he's not a guy you necessarily want to go out of your way to target in redraft, but he offers enough boom weeks where he's going to be someone that you're definitely going to have some best ball interest if you can get him down here in this tier of players. And the guy right behind him, Chris Olave, love him. It wouldn't surprise me at all for him to be the number 1 rookie wide receiver in this class. It wouldn't surprise me at all for him to lead the Saints in every receiving category. And as much as I have my hesitations with Jameis Winston, if you can get a team number 1 wide receiver this late, kind of have to pull the trigger on that.
Definitely. I've been rising on Olave lately too, given the lack of news around Michael Thomas. So hopefully the existence of Jarvis Landry keeps that ADP where it is. And then the last tier, it is a big tier, but there are a couple players who don't deserve to be in this tier at all. And one of them, I want to point out, Michael Gallup, I talked with, as I mentioned, he's coming off the ACL tear. I talked with Edwin Poros yesterday, and he said the earliest that Michael Gallup's probably going to come back is mid-November. So the reality is him going in the top 10 rounds, can't do it, can't pull the trigger in no way unless you have Dak Prescott. But even so, you've want to wait on Michael Gallup. His efficiencies have dropped each of the last couple years. Yeah, in the top 10 rounds, I don't think Michael Gallup deserves to be drafted there.
Agree. That's as soon as you start saying there was a couple guys you didn't like in this tier, that was the first thing that came to mind was like Gallup. I don't want nothing to do with Gallup at this particular time, especially when my boy Rondell Moore sitting there right below him. And yes. I'm a big Rondell Moore honk. He was my hashtag. I don't look for hashtag brands very often, but Moore was the guy that was my brand last year. And it looked like right off the gate it was going to be good, and he faded. But Christian Kirk was 6th in the league last year with a 77.8% slot rate. Well, he's gone. That role is going to Moore now. And you're talking about a guy that showed. I know he was taking short routes often out of the backfield, but you're talking about a guy that was very explosive in dating. He was at 7.9 yards after contact per reception. That was 3rd in the NFL, higher than Jamar Chase. He's also 13th in missed tackles forced at wide receiver, despite the fact that he was only 63rd in targets. So you're talking about an elusive player that I think is going to be in a very positive position out of the slot to see a ton of targets. And if he can continue being that kind of elusive and avoiding tackles and creating, and he's got sneaky high upside, and he's a guy that, like I said, I'm not going to come off my hashtag brand quite yet.
No, I'm also big on Rondell Moore. I'm glad that you're saying that too. I was back in on him in March. I sent out a tweet back on March 2nd, and
real believers never got off of him, man.
Yeah, even with Hollywood Brown joining the team, they did that knowing DeAndre Hopkins was going to get suspended. You're take one in, put one out. If Rondell Moore had a 14% target share as a rookie, not too bad. He was third wide receiver 32 in targets per snap, so that's also pretty good. Wide receiver 22 in target rate. When he was on the field, he was getting targets. He was wide receiver 1. He was the best wide receiver in the entire NFL in catch rate. He wasn't going to drop the ball. I know it's close to the line of scrimmage, but they're scheming him touches. Wide receiver 37 in PPR fantasy points per target, despite only scoring 1 touchdown. He scored 1 touchdown, still a borderline wide receiver 3. The data above is evidence that the Cardinals schemed him, and he's part of their offense. He's not just an afterthought. They design plays for him. And there are some people back in March who were like, oh, he's a bust. He's not a bust. That's foolish. He had 65 targets and 18 rushes in 14 games. So that's 83 touches. That's pretty good. I like Rondell Moore as well. I wonder what kind of upside he'll have, but he might have a pretty safe floor in this Arizona offense.
Agreed.
Okay. Are there any other wide receivers you want to hit on before we call it a night, Jody?
No, I think we did a very good job, and I'm glad to see that we agree on a lot of things, but it's always good to have a little bit of variance in there, because otherwise it's just 2 guys at a time.
Yeah, it's nice to volley with you, Jody, one of the best in the biz. Thanks for joining the podcast tonight. It was great chatting about all these players. You can follow Jody on Twitter, so make sure you are at Jody Smith NFL. You can find his work, Fulltime Fantasy. Any other plugs you want to drop here before the night ends, Jody?
No, then make sure that they're following you. You're the up-and-coming kid in the battle here, so I'm just a veteran trying to hold on to my spot before you take it from me.
I wouldn't take anything from you. I wouldn't. But that'll do it for today's pod. Thanks to everyone for tuning in. If you haven't subscribed to the Best Bell Fantasy Podcast, make sure you do wherever you listen to your podcast. Make sure to check out the Best Bell YouTube channel, where I'll be drafting live throughout the offseason, also having studies like the ones I posted on the YouTube, and interviews and rankings discussions like tonight with Jody and other excellent, respected players in the industry. I've also started a website. Check out bestbellfantasy.com. I put some things up there, but also just some links so you can join in. And I'm working on a few projects myself right now, but I will be updating throughout the season and have a few things revealed on the website as we go from there. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at FFStalder. Thanks for listening. I appreciate it. In the meantime, good luck in the best ball streets.